what's interesting is this is the one event, the Korean War, that most people here in Washington, when you ask them, why do you think China and North Korea today are so close? They'll say, well, because the Chinese helped the North Koreans during the Korean War. But when you look at the historical record, when you look at what the North Koreans were saying, when you look at these reports from, for example, the Soviet embassy after the war, you see that in fact that event that supposedly sealed the relationship in a bond of blood, right. Or made or established this lips and teeth relationship, which an expression that both China and North Korea use in their propaganda to describe a level of intimacy between the two nations. This very event, is in fact is a major source of tension and conflict between North Korea and China.
In the spring of 1950, North Korea's founding leader, Kim Il-sung, received Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's permission to attack South Korea on the condition the Chinese leader Mao Zedong must also agree.
Mao was not happy at that time because China was preparing to launch its attack to conquer Taiwan. Mao told him, "You better wait until we finish Taiwan," Kim Il-sung said. "We were ready. We actually would not need anything from you, and we were going to finish the war very quickly." According to archives, North Korea didn't let the Chinese know of its plan and didn't even inform the Chinese when the war broke out. The top Chinese leadership first learned it from foreign news agencies. 3 days after the Korean War broke out, a military attaché from the North Korean embassy in Beijing told the Chinese government that the war had started.
At first, the North Koreans were successful in their military campaigns. Within 2 months, they captured over 90% of the territory on the Korean peninsula. Then, the situation changed when U.S.-led troops launched a counteroffensive. More than 1 million Chinese People's Volunteers entered the fray, fighting alongside the North Koreans. China took enormous casualties, with 149,000 dead and 220,000 injured. There were reportedly 21,300 Chinese captured as POWs.
There were some disagreements over or between the Chinese and the North Koreans over field tactics. Kim Il-sung blamed the Chinese for not carrying out a major campaign, but the Chinese People's Volunteers were so exhausted after a long campaign that they did need to stop, regroup, get some rest before carrying on the offensive. But Kim Il-sung just he saw that they had the initiative and thought that this was the opportunity to keep pushing forward to, he said, push the Yankees into the sea. But so eventually the North Koreans would come because the Chinese insisted on taking that break and halting the offensive for a short period. Kim Il-sung would later blame the Chinese for not having unified the Korean peninsula.
After the war, China provided economic assistance to rebuilding in North Korea, even though China too was in dire economic straits. Meanwhile, a Sino-Soviet split worsened and culminated in the withdrawal of Soviet experts working in China. North Korea's Kim Il-sung exploited that split between Beijing and Moscow to advance North Korea's border negotiations with China and gain border lines he desired.
In Mao's mind, the Sino-Soviet dispute was a much bigger issue, which threatened China's national security, so he had to keep Kim Il-sung on his side. He made a major compromise, mainly the border demarcation issue with North Korea in northeast China. Not only he ceded part of the Shangbai Mountain and Heaven Lake to North Korea, he even told Kim Il-sung that the entire northeast China would be under his control in the future. Kim Il-sung was exclaimed. In 1963, he came to northeast China for a tour. Mao asked Deng Xiaoping to be his escort. High-ranking officials from Liaoning, Jilin, and Heilongjiang were waiting in line to report to him. When Kim Il-sung returned to North Korea, he arranged for a workshop for Northeast China cadres. So at that time, Kim Il-sung felt great. He thought the Northeast was his.
After Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, China and North Korea relations became even rockier.
This led to perhaps the lowest point in the history of China and North Korea relations. You had, as with most countries, I think with the exception of Egypt, the ambassador was withdrawn. Right. But you had the Chinese Red Guards denouncing Kim Il-sung publicly in their newspapers, calling for the North Koreans to launch their own cultural revolution and to overthrow Kim Il-sung, who they were very upset with because he wasn't taking sides in the ongoing Sino-Soviet split. They called him a fence-sitter.
A slow thaw between the two countries came a few years later when a U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane was shot down by the North Korean military, killing 31 U.S. service members. The downing reignited the crisis on the Korean peninsula. For security purposes, China and North Korea came together. North Korea sent a delegation to Beijing for the celebration of the anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic.
The Chinese leadership made a provincial decision to invite the North Korean delegation on September 30 to attend the celebration. The invitation was sent at 3 p.m. At 6 p.m., North Korea responded by sending a delegation to Beijing led by Cho Yong-gong. At 11:30 p.m., the North Korean delegation arrived. The next day, Cho met with Mao at Tiananmen. They had a very good conversation.
We can have differences without being enemies in war.
It was another simple arrival.
But the continuing Sino-Soviet split brought China and the United States closer. U.S. President Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong forged U.S.-China rapprochement in the 1970s.
Breakthrough by President Nixon and Chairman Mao in 1971 and 72 obviously was an enormous blow for the Soviet Union and for North Korea. And so that put North Korea in a more awkward position, but at the same time it had the support of the Soviet Union that continued at that time, while China lost an interest in using North Korea as a pressure point on the United States. So the dynamics of the politics changed during that period.
We had the opportunity to have talks with Chairman Mao.
As U.S.-China ties increased, North Korea became enraged with China.
The engagement between China and the U.S. began. Henry Kissinger went to China in 1971, and President Nixon went to visit China in 1972. The rapprochement between China and the U.S. posed significant impact to China's relationship with North Korea. Why? Because North Korea was still technically at war with the United States. For the North Koreans, the Chinese went to shake hands with the Americans is a betrayal, a damage.
But North Korea needed China. In April 1975, Kim Il-sung went to Beijing. He hoped that China could support him in an idea to reunify the Korean peninsula with force.
I think the frustration that Kim Il-sung had with Deng Xiaoping in the mid-1970s reflected to their great ideological divide, because at that point Kim Il-sung was still talking about revolutionary war, and Deng Xiaoping had adopted a very pragmatic approach to reform and opening up. So by the mid-1970s, I agree the two countries were on very different ideological and developmental trajectories.
The different tracks set North Korea and China apart.
Because that meant that China's domestic economic policies were no longer consistent with the state run system of the socialist system in North Korea.
As China's economic reforms widened in the 1980s, China found new trade avenues with an unlikely partner, South Korea.
By the mid-80s, China was moving in the direction of economic reform, economic development, and didn't want to do anything that would jeopardize that, the stability, and do anything that would jeopardize that growth. And the North Koreans were jeopardizing that, and the North Koreans also, it was becoming increasingly clear, were not developing their economy, and were not a major asset for China economically, while South Korea was. And that trade relationship grew to the point where it made sense to establish political relations as well.
In early 1990s, China and South Korea held secret negotiations regarding the establishing of diplomatic relations. The Chinese kept the North Koreans in the dark until the last minute. North Korea saw this as an ultimate betrayal.
By 1992, the special relationship between China and North Korea, the brotherly affection or the alliance, no longer existed. That page was turned over. I think from that moment, the North Koreans totally distrusted China. In their eyes, China is their number one enemy. In the communist world, a traitor is worse than enemies, isn't it?
After the passing of Kim Il-sung, his son Kim Jong-il became the leader of North Korea. In the following years, the China-North Korea relationship remained tense.
Kim Jong-il had a very poor relationship with Beijing. It took 7 years. So for 7 years the relationship was very strained. No leader from either country visited the other's country, and then it seemed that Kim Jong-il was persuaded that that North Korea could survive and in fact be strengthened by introducing some Chinese-style reforms, so it looked like things were improving, but then the relationship degenerated again over North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons.
North Korea's pursuit of nuclear and missile programs changed the dynamic of its relations with China.
You've seen a downgrading, in effect, of China's policy toward North Korea after 2013, when Xi Jinping said that China and North Korea would have normal relations. So it no longer is a relationship organized through party-to-party ties, but rather government-to-government ties, or government-to-government relations. So that's a significant shift.
When Kim Jong-un, the current North Korean leader, came to power in 2012, he prioritized the development of the country's nuclear and long-range ballistic missile capabilities.
It believes that it needs nuclear weapons to survive. They see what the United States has done in Iraq. They see what the United States has done in Afghanistan, where American policy has been to promote regime change in countries that it believes are a danger. And so to the North Koreans, the only way they can prevent the United States from implementing regime change in their country is if they have a deterrent. One deterrent that they have always had is the artillery that's pointing at Seoul. Even without nuclear weapons, North Korea could do a tremendous amount of damage to South Korea, billions of dollars worth of damage within hours. But they feel that they need an even stronger deterrent.
While China was reluctant to rein in North Korea's nuclear ambitions, China did impose harsher trade sanctions against North Korea with the United Nations framework to curb North Korea's nuclear activities. That further angered North Korea.
We have seen North Korea is treating China as its major enemy. In the event of a nuclear war, in the event of major changes, China may be the first to feel the brunt. Not necessarily South Korea, not necessarily Japan. China worries about it.
After the Trump administration came to office, the new U.S. administration used trade issues as bargaining chips to put pressure on China to do more against North Korea. But China's influence may be limited.
One thing we are certain of is that the Chinese cannot tell North Koreans that you need to suspend your nuclear program. They won't listen, that is for sure. The Chinese cannot tell them what not to do. The Chinese cannot intervene in their domestic politics.
These days, China and North Korea are re-examining their priorities with one another.
The simplistic way of looking at the debate is that there are those who still put high value on ideological history and even the shared history of struggle against the Japanese and against the United States, in fact. And then there are others who look more at Chinese foreign policy in terms of interests. And in that group of people, that group doesn't necessarily argue for abandoning North Korea, but they want a real rethink of North Korean policy.
As that debate continues, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made a secret visit to China in late March. That was after the announcement that the Trump administration was working towards a Trump-Kim summit in May or June. The short and warmly received visit to Beijing seems to have brought a thaw to the troubled relationship between China and North Korea, though its future remains uneasy and murky.